Hello friends, the 20th century and early 21st century witnessed a series of transformative movements that reshaped political landscapes through non-violent means. India's independence movement, the Philippines People Power Revolution of 1986, Ukraine's Orange Revolution of 2004, Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution of 1989, and Georgia's Rose Revolution of 2003 stand as landmark examples of peaceful or democratic revolutions. These movements were distinct in their historical and cultural contexts, but they share a common thread. They resorted to non-violent means to cause systemic changes. Central to this paradigm is the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, whose principles of non-violence or ahimsa and civil disobedience or satyagraha provided a blueprint for mass mobilization without bloodshed. India's struggle for independence from British colonial rule is a cornerstone of non-violent resistance. Under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, the Indian National Congress mobilized millions through campaigns like the non-cooperation movement between 1920 and 1922, the Salt March in 1930, and the Quit India movement of 1942. His philosophy of satyagraha, truth and resistance, emphasized moral force over physical violence. By boycotting British goods, institutions, and laws, Indians exposed the economic and moral fragility of the colonial rule. For instance, the Salt March was a symbolic act of defiance against the salt tax, which galvanized mass participation and global attention. Gandhi's approach was rooted in universal principles, which involved non-violence, self-sacrifice, and the power of collective action. His strategies were deeply philosophical, aiming to transform both the oppressor and the oppressed. The movement's success in 1947 demonstrated that non-violent resistance could dismantle an empire, no matter how powerful it might be. This precedent inspired subsequent movements worldwide, establishing Gandhi as a global symbol of peaceful revolution. In February 1986, the Philippines underwent a dramatic transformation through the People Power Revolution. It ousted President Ferdinand Marcos after 2 decades of authoritarian rule. Triggered by a fraudulent election, the revolution saw millions of Filipinos gather in Manila's Epifanio de los Santos Avenue or EDSA to demand Marcos's resignation. Led by figures like Corazon Aquino and supported by the Catholic Church, the movement relied on peaceful protests, prayer vigils, and human chains to block military advances. The revolution's non-violent character was evident in its imagery, which involved nuns kneeling before tanks, civilians offering flowers to soldiers, and mass prayers. Within 4 days, Marcos fled, and Aquino assumed the presidency, restoring democracy in Philippines. The movement's success lay in its ability to unite diverse groups, which comprised students, clergy, and military defectors, through a shared commitment to peaceful change. The People Power Revolution echoed Gandhian principles, the use of mass mobilization, symbolic acts like prayers and vigils, and moral pressure on the regime mirrored Gandhi's strategies. The Catholic Church's role, emphasizing forgiveness and nonviolence paralleled Gandhi's spiritual approach to resistance. However, the revolution was more spontaneous and less ideologically rigid than Gandhi's meticulously planned campaigns. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia was a non-violent uprising that ended 4 decades of communist rule in November-December of 1989. Sparked by the brutal suppression of a student protest in Prague, the movement grew into mass demonstrations, strikes, and public dialogues led by figures like Václav Havel and the Civic Forum. The revolution's name reflects its peaceful nature, with protesters using flowers, candles, and theater performances to challenge the regime's legitimacy. Havel's concept of living in truth emphasized moral integrity and non-violent dissent, aligning with Gandhi's satyagraha. Within weeks, the communist government collapsed and Havel became president, marking a transition to democracy. The revolution's success stemmed from its broad coalition of students, intellectuals, workers, and artists, and its refusal to engage in violence despite police repression. Havel and other dissidents were familiar with global non-violent movements, including India's independence struggle. The emphasis on moral resistance and public truth-telling echoed Gandhi's belief in exposing injustice through peaceful means. The use of symbolic acts such as placing flowers at protest sites resembled Gandhi's use of symbolism. For example, the spinning wheel. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine was a response to electoral fraud in the 2004 presidential election, which favored pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych. Led by Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, protesters occupied Kyiv's Independence Square. They wore orange to symbolize their demand for a fair election. The movement combined mass protests, tent cities, and strikes with negotiations and international pressure. After weeks of peaceful demonstrations, the Supreme Court ordered a re-vote, leading to Yushchenko's victory and a shift towards democratic governance. The revolution's non-violent strategy relied on public unity, media engagement, and international solidarity. Protesters used humor, music, and orange symbols to maintain morale and global attention. They avoided clashes with security forces. Ukrainian activists were likely inspired by global non-violent movements, including those influenced by Gandhi, such as the US civil rights movement. The use of mass gatherings and symbolic colors, like, say, orange ribbons, paralleled Gandhi's use of collective action and symbols like khadi. Georgia's Rose Revolution ousted President Eduard Shevardnadze in November 2003 following rigged parliamentary elections. Led by Mikhail Saakashvili and the Khmara Youth Movement, protesters stormed parliament with roses in hand, symbolizing their commitment to non-violence. The movement combined street protests, media campaigns, and international support to force Shevardnadze's resignation. This paved the way for democratic reforms. The revolution's success lay in its disciplined non-violence and strategic use of symbols. Roses conveyed peace while challenging the regime's authority. Khmara's non-violent tactics emphasized grassroots mobilization and public pressure. The Rose Revolution's leaders were influenced by modern non-violent movements, particularly Otpor, which itself drew on Jean Sharp's theories of non-violent resistance. Sharp's work was heavily inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. The use of roses as a symbol of peaceful defiance echoed Gandhi's symbolic acts, and the emphasis on mass participation reflected his belief in collective power. However, the revolution's tactics were pragmatic and less spiritually driven than Gandhi's, reflecting a blend of influences. All five revolutions share key characteristics: mass participation, non-violent strategies, symbolic acts, and a focus on systemic change. India's independence movement set a global precedent using boycotts, marches, and civil disobedience to challenge colonial rule. The Philippines, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Georgia adopted these principles, employing protests, symbols like flowers, candles, orange ribbons, roses, etc., and moral pressure to undermine authoritarian regimes. Each movement leveraged public unity and international attention to achieve political transformation without bloodshed. The revolutions differed in their contexts, leadership, and tactics. India's movement was a prolonged struggle against colonial rule, spanning decades and rooted in Gandhi's spiritual philosophy. The Philippines revolution was swift, driven by a specific electoral crisis and religious symbolism. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution was intellectual and theatrical, which reflected its dissident culture. Ukraine's Orange Revolution combined grassroots protests with legal and international strategies, while Georgia's Rose Revolution was youth driven and influenced by modern nonviolent training. All revolutions achieved significant political change. India gained independence, the Philippines restored democracy, Czechoslovakia transitioned to a democratic republic, Ukraine secured a fair election, and Georgia ousted a corrupt regime. However, long term outcomes varied. India faced partition and communal violence. The Philippines struggled with political instability. Czechoslovakia later split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia and then achieved stable democracy. Ukraine faced ongoing tensions with Russia, and Georgia's reforms were partially undone by later conflicts. These variations highlight the complexity of sustaining revolutionary gains. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence and civil disobedience undeniably shaped the global landscape of peaceful resistance. His success in India provided a model for mobilizing masses without violence, inspiring movements across the world. The People Power Revolution, Velvet Revolution, Orange Revolution, and Rose Revolution, all of these revolutions reflect elements of Gandhi's approach, particularly in their use of mass protests, which were backed by symbolic acts and moral pressure. However, the extent of Gandhi's direct influence varies. In the Philippines, Catholic teachings and local traditions played a larger role, with Gandhi's ideas serving as an indirect inspiration through global nonviolent movements. In Czechoslovakia, Havel's philosophy of living in truth aligned with Gandhi's principles but was rooted in local dissident traditions. Ukraine and Georgia drew heavily on modern non-violent strategies, particularly from Serbia's Otpor and Gene Sharp, who adapted Gandhi's ideas to contemporary contexts. Gandhi's philosophy was deeply tied to India's spiritual traditions, which did not always resonate in secular or Christian majority contexts. Moreover, later revolutions benefited from modern tools, and these tools were media, international NGOs, and training in non-violent tactics that were unavailable in Gandhi's time. In fact, Gandhi himself created those tactics, he originated those tactics. Thus, while Gandhi's ideas provided a fundamental framework, each movement adapted them to its unique circumstances. The peaceful revolutions of India, the Philippines, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Georgia demonstrate the enduring power of non-violent resistance to bring about political change. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha and ahimsa provided a universal template inspiring these movements to varying degrees. While India's independence struggle was a direct product of Gandhi's vision, the people power, velvet, orange, and rose revolutions adapted his principles to their contexts, blending them with local traditions and modern strategies. The versatility of non-violent resistance and the nuanced legacy of Gandhi's thought continues to inspire transformative movements worldwide. In case you have liked my video, please do like, subscribe, share and comment. Thank you.